This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is from Paul's letter to the Romans, beginning in chapter 8 at verse 14 through verse 17. It's the basis for the sermon at the First Free Methodist Church on June 14, 2026. It's part of our series called Built on Grace, Being Known and Loved. So let's hear the text first from Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse 14. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons and daughters of God. For you have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons and daughters, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may be also glorified with him. We'll take a look at this text in two different parts. First, we'll look at verses 14 and 15, which focus on being adopted, and then we'll look at verses 16 and 17 to focus on this notion of life as family. So let's take this look at the first two verses, verses 14 and 15, about being adopted. Now, Paul's letter to the Romans is written after the Jewish return from their brief exile that they experienced under Emperor Claudius. Claudius expelled all of the Jews from the city of Rome during his reign as emperor, and about 56 CE. And those Jewish residents of Rome, and some of whom were Jews who had become Christians, so they were Jewish Christians, also returned to Rome. And so in this return to Rome, the Roman church finds itself trying to reintegrate itself between Gentiles who are part of that congregation and now Jews who were expelled from Rome who are now returning. So Jews and Gentiles, they were finding a great deal of difficulty in reconnecting in a church that was really, it was split along ethnic lines and religious lines. Now, Paul's foundation is built on this particular teaching here about adoption, sonship, and children. And he offers an important qualifier as verse 14 opens. He says, for all those led by the Spirit of God. Now, he doesn't begin with a pedigree of biological birth like with the Jews who are descendants of Abraham. They would have expected him to start in that manner. The qualifier is being led by the Spirit. For all those who are led by the Spirit are the sons of God. That phrase, led by the Spirit, it probably could be literally translated better by simply saying being constrained by a compelling force. Being led by the Spirit is a powerful force at work in life. And in this particular context, this verb is written in the passive voice. And the passive voice means that the subject of the sentence is being acted on by the object of the sentence, the object of it. So in this case, all who are being, that's the community in Rome, are being acted upon because they're led by the Spirit. Now, this idea here, being led by the Spirit, doesn't just mean conversion. It has to do with faith in continual obedience. For a Methodist, this is a rich concept within John Wesley's teaching in Charles Wesley's hymns, that Wesley talked about this being led by the Spirit is a combination of two things. It's our tempers, he called them, which is our kind of inward virtues or fruit of the Spirit, and our actions are led by the Spirit, that there is an outward obedience and grace and humility. And we'll talk more about this in the sermon, but the idea here is that being led by the Spirit isn't just a moment of conversion. It's kind of a lifelong journey where John Wesley would say our tempers and our actions are framed in that kind of obedience. What it reflects is the condition of the Spirit's dominance in the life of a believer? Are believers led by the Spirit? And are they led by the Spirit on an ongoing basis? And then after that phrase comes a remarkable teaching in verse 14. If the condition of being led by the Spirit happens, that makes us sons of God. Now, careful with that phrase. It's not a cause and effect, but it certainly is a qualifier. Now, some translations, like the one I read from the 2020 version of the New American Standard Bible, it'll say, the sons and daughters of God. And I appreciate what the translators are attempting to do. I would say, though, that the text does not say daughters. It just says sons. And for the sake of this passage, I just, bear with me, stick with sons just for a little bit, because Paul is going to make the natural evolution himself in this very passage. So try not to force something into the text that's not quite there yet. Now, sonship in both Roman and Jewish context is critical. In Jewish context, sons were expected to follow their fathers in terms of their vocation. And even in Roman culture, that was a certain degree of expectation, although it was more formulated along socioeconomic lines and social status than it was doing the exact same job your father did, let's say. But what's clear here is that daughters, on the other hand, this was not so. Daughters would leave their father's household and become part, of another household. And so the idea of son here is important because becoming a son of God is not now by birth, as the Jewish believers would have looked to, descendants of Abraham and such. It's not by social status, which is what Roman believers would have looked at. It's not even by geography. Sonship is now grounded in a simple condition. It's this at the beginning of verse 14, all those who are being led by the Spirit, not Abrahamic lineage, not Roman status, none of that. All those who are being led by the Spirit are sons of God. Now, Paul elaborates on the meaning further by defining what sonship is not. He says, in the next verse, you've not received a spirit of slavery. And this is in contrast to all those who are being led by the Spirit. This has to do with the context that Paul started out with back in verses 12 and 13, if you want to read those in Romans 8. It's a contrast between those led by the Spirit and led by the flesh. So he's saying you haven't received a spirit of slavery, because this promise is for all those who are being led by the Spirit. And it's a critical difference. It's the difference of choice or mandate. A slave has no choice. Those who led by the Spirit do have choice. It's the difference between following rules or having an affection. It has to do with the difference of love or slavery. And again, this ties back to what John Wesley writes about this very text in his very well-known sermon, that obedience is born out of love. It's not born out of obligation or slavery. And this is what Paul's trying to tell the Romans. It's critical that being led by the Spirit is naturally grounded in love and grace. It's not grounded in fear. So Paul now frames this sonship clearly as it comes into being. Sonship, of course, for the Jews is grounded in their relationship to Abraham. For Gentiles, it's grounded in social status. In both cases, it has a lot to do with birth, biology. And Paul states that this relationship now we enter into with God, whether we're Jew or Gentile, is really about adoption. Adoption is completely foreign in a Jewish context, since familial lines would typically lay claim to a parentless child. So if in Jewish culture, if there's a child without a parent, an orphan, someone in the family lays claim to that child and raises them. This is so much the case within Jewish culture that in ancient Hebrew, there actually is no word at all in their vocabulary for adoption. It was a thing that simply didn't exist. But adoption was well known in the Roman world, since there was not as much of a family obligation to raise orphans. But notice, very careful here, he doesn't just say adoption. He says it's the spirit of adoption. Well, what spirit? Well, if we look backwards in the text, we can begin to clearly see that the Spirit he's talking about is the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, that this is the work of God's Spirit. Now, Gentiles along with Jews, are brought into the bond shared together in a family. So the concept of the spirit of adoption, to be honest, is really not talked about too much in terms of the Holy Spirit's work. But for Paul, it's core to what the Spirit does in the life of a believer. Now, when we receive that spirit of adoption, as he's telling the Romans they do, then he says that they become sons through that process. Remember, Paul's going to broaden that term shortly, so just hold on. Just focus on sons for a minute because it's grounded in the culture of both the Jews and the Romans. And then he says that by that Spirit, we cry out. And that word for cry out is important. Oftentimes we zip past it to get to the words Abba and Father, which come next. But just hold on to cry out for a minute. It's a Greek verb, krazo, and it denotes like a groaning, like a deep utterance. It's almost ecstatic. It's something that kind of comes from the very depths of who we are. So it's not just an acclamation. It's a kind of a deep emotional expression of crying out to God. And what is it we cry out? What is it that this verb krazo is trying to tell us? Well, we cry out Abba, which is a word that's Aramaic for father. And it's a word used by children, but it's also a word used by adults. So sometimes you'll hear this word Abba described as daddy. I would lean away from that definition because there's adult men and women who speak of their father as Abba. So it's not like a childish term. It's just simply the word people use to refer to their father. There's only one person who bears this title, and it's one's own biological father. And if you're a Jewish person, of course, father refers to Abraham as well. So Abba is just a common word used. The best way I could describe it would be like just saying not daddy, but dad. It's informal, it's intimate, but it's not childish. But for the Roman audience, Abba has no meaning for them. The Gentiles, that word Abba carries no load with it. For them, the second word Paul uses, he says Abba, Father. The word for father, Greek word pater, is used in the same kind of context because it's referring to one's own father. That word doesn't mean anything else than one's kind of biological father. So this adoption is not to some kind of cause or effort or purpose. It's an adoption of relationship that kind of comes deep from within us. And that opens up a key passageway for us, that we're bound in a family of God's love. We are bound in a family of God's love. The more we leave the notion of Christianity as a cause, the better. We are fundamentally grounded in our relationship to God and the world as children of God. So the Lord is telling us in this passage that the Spirit works adoption in our life, that we're all made children of God by the work of the Spirit. Though the more we frame our life in this way, the better. I think it's safe to say that God is not building a movement, rather that God is building a community in relationship with Him. And that community is the community of Jesus. And it is a family of love. Let's look at verses 16 and 17 to talk about this life as a family now. See, the basis of family has now been laid by Paul using kind of this revolutionary teaching about adoption. And another revolutionary piece of his theology is now built on top of that. He says in verse 16 that the Spirit testifies with our spirit. And this means that the Spirit is like our co-witness. So the word there in Greek is not a very common word. Sum marturie is the word, and it's uncommon, but it's used in several contexts in Paul's time. It's kind of a choice word. That there's a prefix to it, sum, which is a short, kind of an augmented form of soon. Whenever you see soon in front of a word, it means together. Like we use a word in English all the time, synagogue, S-Y-N, or we describe the Gospels The three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is synoptic Gospels, S-Y-N. That's the same idea. It's like together. And then the second word, which is the word for witness or testimony, martyreo, it means to witness or testify. So what's happening is the Spirit is testifying together with us of our adoption as sons. But notice the change. There's a shift that happens. The Spirit's work is to testify with our spirit, and that namely agrees with us and encourages us. It gives clarity. It reminds us of who we are. But note that Paul makes the shift here. He does not say sons of God. Notice what he says, children of God. It's a deliberate word choice on his part, that the notion of sons, which is a Greek word huios, is now left behind, and it has been replaced with a new word Paul uses, teknon, which is the word for child. So this particular word is not a male or female noun. It is broadening the circle that this adoption has that makes us all children of God. So I think it's fascinating when you read the text. It starts out with sons, but as he starts talking about the Spirit's work, he himself naturally broadens its context away from sons to now it's children, and that metaphor will remain throughout the rest of the passage of being children of God, including men and women. Now, there are some more dimensions to this notion of adoption that's relevant to children. First, Paul says that we're children, part of the family of God's people, and then says heirs also. Heirs also, as you get into verse 17, is not just about property or possessions, but really what being an heir means in this context is inheriting the name of the Father, the life, the reputation, the character of the Father. This is so critical for us to hear. It's not just about possessions the way we think of an inheritance. This inheritance is the giving of God's own self to us so that we might share in some of those very characteristics of who God is. And then continues, he says, fellow heirs with Christ. So now the intersection of Jesus becomes clear in this context because now we're children of God, just like Jesus is a child of God. He is our brother, and we are siblings with him and fellow heirs with him in love. But just as we started out in verse 14, where it says, for all who are being led by the Spirit are the sons of God. That's a qualifier. Here comes another qualifier in this relationship in verse 17. Paul says that these things are true, that we're children of God, we're heirs and heirs also, and fellow heirs with Christ. Then he attaches a condition to it. If we suffer with him. That verb for suffer is in what's called in Greek the subjunctive mood. And the subjunctive mood means it's a verb that has some sort of conditionality to it. So if we suffer with him, and that conditionality can take a lot of different flavors. That verb mood communicates at times uncertainty. If we suffer with him. So what Paul's trying to make clear is that this blessing will require much of this in this age. Remember, Paul's writing this to a church that has suffered an exile. Emperor Claudius has expelled all the Jews from Rome, and they've now returned upon his death. And so this is really their kind of first wholesale state persecution that Jews and Christians have suffered under Roman power. And it will get much worse in less than a decade later with the crazy Emperor Nero. The persecution will become much more severe. So Paul's trying to communicate that the suffering we do with him, with Jesus, that aligns us to the kind of suffering Jesus endured at the hands of the state. And then Paul says, so that we may be glorified with him. That's such a beautiful verse, the way he frames it. And that glorified is in the subjunctive mood again. It's in the mood of conditionality. So if we suffer with him, then we'll be glorified with him. It's an if-then kind of statement. Now, this is not glorification waiting till the end of time. It's a very rare usage of this word glorified. Normally, this verb is in the active voice, but this time it's in the passive voice because it's sitting in a conditional sentence. So us being glorified is not a guarantee. Rather, it's held as a promise for us according to the condition, if we suffer with him. There's glory to be experienced in this life as a child of God, and that glory is the glory that comes only from God. So that our worship of God in this expression of praise and thanksgiving is grounded in the truth that if we suffer with him, we will be glorified with him. It's kind of a family reunion of glory when we gather together as the community of faith. And that opens the final key passageway for us. Our relationship with God reforms every relationship. You know, Jesus talked at length about family bonds. You can read a story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is reminded that his mother and his siblings have arrived. And he asks, well, who are my mother or my brothers or my sisters? And he says, my brothers and sisters are those that do the will of God. That's very much in keeping with what Paul says here. The relationship we have with adopted children reshapes every relationship we have in our life. Paul is arguing for a closeness of a family with God, with Christ, and with one another. And our worship and our fellowship are fueled by this truth that our relationship with God as adopted children reforms every relationship we have in our life. I want to thank you for listening to the FFMC podcast. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them all right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our church's website at ffmc.org or to get our app for your mobile device. FFMC is the name of the app. Install it on your mobile device to keep up with all that's happening at First Free Methodist Church. Use our app or our website to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.